Cold War relic, rusting away at sea.
It's an environmental disaster waiting to happen.
A remote American research lab with a dark past.
Astronauts are guinea pigs. We're trying to understand how the human body is affected.
And a groundbreaking Nazi project with a sinister end.
It was all about national pride. We're going to take the vehicles and make us leaders of the entire known world.
Once, they were some of the most advanced structures and facilities on the planet, at the cutting edge of design and construction. Today, they stand abandoned, contaminated, and sometimes deadly. But who built them and how? And why were they abandoned? Hidden in Eastern Europe, in the heart of the Czech Republic, obscured by dense forests, is one of the greatest secrets from the Second World War. Partially submerged under the Zhíkov Reservoir is one of the most advanced transportation projects ever undertaken during this war-torn period. It's 330 feet high, 72 feet wide, and is made of reinforced concrete.
If you could take away the millions of gallons of water beneath it, the whole structure becomes clear. But as it is now, you can't see any of that. It's a hidden gem.
But why was this mysterious bridge built? And why was it abandoned? In 1939, Hitler's engineers are working to develop a vast new road system to unite every corner of the so-called Third Reich, which includes the entire country of Czechoslovakia. And its new freeways, known as autobahns, reflect the new optimism of the country. But in order to carry people and goods from rural areas of Czechoslovakia to its capital city, Prague, and onto Berlin, engineers begin constructing this. The Borovsko Bridge, also known as Hitler's Bridge.
The bridge, of course, was known as Hitler's Bridge. It was to form a vital part of what was going to be the Central European Highway. And this is really his vision, not just of melding together the disparate parts of the empire he's creating, but also its military use and the speed with which troops can actually move down this road to whichever part of the Reich is threatened.
There was undoubtedly more to Hitler's Autobahn than just getting from A to B. It was all about national pride. It was all about, wow, look at this audacious Autobahn that we're going to take the vehicles that are going to communicate with the Reich and make us leaders of the entire known world. It was all about dominating. That's what Hitler's Autobahns were.
And its dimensions are simply mind-blowing.
In the time when it was built, Czechoslovakia was one of very few countries in the world that planned to build highways that wide. The width of the bridge is 22 meters. It's divided in two bridges. On each bridge, there should be 2 lanes for the traffic.
The bridge spans across the Zhíkov Valley, near the village of Borovsko. It rises to 330 feet in height, with a single arch spanning the stream below. Workers labor constantly for what's hailed as the future of engineering.
They started the construction of the bridge in 1939. They built most of the load-bearing structure by 1942. The original project counted on 800 workers to be here on the construction site, but in reality they got just 150 men. There were some delays in the construction, but still they managed to complete the whole load-bearing structure in 2 years.
But then the engineers face a problem. To maintain the speed of the autobahns, the new bridge must be built with a tilted surface.
It was a straight bridge, but at the same time, behind the bridge there should be a curve. So this is why the bridge leans to the right side. The bridge was designed for the speed of the vehicles, like 160 kilometers per hour, to reduce the effects of the forces acting on the cars. You need to design the bridge a little bit skew. It's not a reason of some settlement in the foundation. It is how it should be.
Not only that, but Germany demands that this new motorway and its bridges be finished by 1943. Despite shortages of labor, equipment, and even cement, the engineers at Borovsko used the latest techniques for their bridge.
If you do strip away all the surroundings and you can see the structure of the bridge, it's a reinforced concrete arch bridge, which is a very common type of bridge. But yet this was being built in the 1930s. Especially reinforced concrete was not a common used material for that kind of structure at this time. So it just goes to show how forward-thinking and how advanced Czechoslovakia was in their infrastructure technology.
But in July 1941, Hitler launches an unexpected invasion of the Soviet Union, and most public works are canceled across Czechoslovakia. Thousands of tons of concrete that were originally planned for road and bridge construction are diverted to the war effort to create vast defensive systems. But because the Borovsko Bridge is so important, the work here continues.
Here we're using a new material in a way that has real structural integrity in an arch bridge, making intricate shapes, intricate forms. That was groundbreaking. That was pushing technology to the boundaries at the time.
But then, history plays its hand. In May 1942, the hated Nazi overlord in charge of much of occupied Czechoslovakia, the so-called blonde beast, Reinhard Heydrich, is assassinated by members of the Czech resistance.
The assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, a member of Hitler's inner circle, sent a shockwave into the Reich that they were not invincible. In fact, they were vulnerable.
All work on the Borovsko Bridge grinds to a halt. Despite this temporary setback, why is this engineering marvel flooded? And why was it abandoned? As part of Nazi Germany, the Borovsko Bridge in Czechoslovakia forms a critical junction for the Third Reich's vision of a vast network of autobahns, with aims to connect the four corners of Nazi Europe. During World War II, construction of the bridge comes to a halt, and after the war, Czechoslovakia falls under communist rule. Though the new leadership completes the construction in 1950, the bridge is ultimately scrapped.
In this time, the communists were leading our country, and they focused more on the heavy industry, and the heavy industry preferred railways to motorways. So, as a result, the highway leading to the Hitler's Bridge was never built, and it's just standing here.
So why was the bridge flooded? With the nearby capital of Prague growing exponentially, Czech authorities transformed the Sedlicky River into a water reservoir in 1976, nearly submerging the Borovsko Bridge in its entirety.
Of course, the cover layer of the concrete is deteriorated, but it's still standing here. It's under the water. In fact, it was not designed to be flooded in water, and still it's, I would say, quite a good shape. So, yeah, they did a good work.
Today, Hitler's bridge lies neglected and abandoned.
Hitler's abandoned bridge is a poetic, symbolic testament to the technology of the Nazis.
you have this living, breathing example of Nazi architecture, in fact, Nazi ambition. It needs to remain as a reminder and as an example of what misguided people are capable of getting up to.
"650 miles west, in the southern English port of Rochester, lies a mysterious submarine. It's 280 feet long, 20 feet wide, and weighs nearly 2,000 tons. Powered by diesel-electric engines and capable of firing 22 torpedoes, this rusting hulk was designed to start World War III.
They looked intimidating. The sheer numbers they were churning out, wow.
These guys are forward-looking, they're adventurous, they're ambitious, and the projects that they end up commissioning, once they've made sure the technology works, are really impressive.
Still enough of a threat to worry and keep the Americans and NATO busy looking for them and keep track of them, because they knew they still had nuclear capability.
But how did this underwater warrior end up off the coast of England? And why was it abandoned? In the 1950s, Cold War tensions between the Soviet Union and the Western powers are brewing. Though both sides are stockpiling nuclear weaponry for all eyes to see, much of the standoff is happening below the surface, literally.
When we talk about the Cold War, we often imagine everybody sitting still in a fur coat. In fact, a very large amount is happening. We know there's a covert war in the air. We know the Americans are spying over Russia. But everybody is using submarines to creep into each other's backyards and do a bit of intercept and spying. The British and the Americans are spying on the Russians. The Russians are trying to pick them up and stop them spying.
And taking the next step in espionage, the Soviet Union constructs this, the Foxtrot-class submarine, codename B-39U-475, also known as the Black Widow. It forms an integral part of the most powerful striking arm of the Soviet fleet.
The submarine is in many ways the iconic warship of the Cold War because it's the most active. It's the one you can use without leaving a visible trace.
Also invisible to the Allied forces, the Foxtrot submarines are carrying torpedoes, armed with nuclear warheads.
This is the forward torpedo room of B-49. And this is one of 22 torpedoes that it could have carried. Mainly high explosive warheads, but they did have a nuclear tip torpedo capability. These are the all-important torpedo firing handles. So once one is illuminated, say at number 5, they would pull the switch and off it goes.
To power these terrifying vessels, the Soviets rely on tested technology. While the U.S. and British navies use all nuclear-powered submarine forces, the USSR used traditional diesel-electric boats.
The Soviet approach to their submarine warfare was very much a case of, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The Soviet kept their diesel powered because it did the job. They got to where they needed to be, albeit not at the greatest level of comfort at all. You'd be so cramped down inside these machines with these 3 great big locomotive diesel engines going off 24/7 all the time. The noise and the smells must have just been awful down there.
Many have wondered why the USSR kept building this outdated technology right up until the 1980s, this Foxtrot class of subs. You know, surely there's new technology they could bring to bear. There is, but they have a manufacturing line that's just churning out quantity over quality. And that's what it's all about. They're using what they know because it's all about numbers. Sure, they can innovate, but why would you change when you've got a good thing going?
But there's a problem with this technological approach. Conventional diesel-powered submarines, like this one, typically can't stay underwater for much longer than a few days.
they were so claustrophobic. You had one bathroom, 2 showers, 74 men. You can imagine after a few days how disgusting that is. I mean, it's a miracle they can make these long journeys across the Atlantic at all. It mystifies me.
Will the Soviet strategy of low-tech propulsion and high-tech firepower work? And why was this Cold War relic abandoned? Disused and abandoned in the waters of Rochester in Kent in England lies a Russian U-class submarine known as the Black Widow. As the foil to Western submarine espionage, the nuclear Black Widow forms a major part of the Soviet fleet. It carries up to 22 torpedoes, 2 of which are armed with nuclear warheads. The Soviets give this fleet of submarines one aim: to serve on the front lines of World War III. But this terrifying ambition comes at a cost for the crew.
Okay, this is the engine room, the Foxtrot submarine, and as you can see, if I shine this around, there are 3 engines driving the 3 propellers. The Foxtrot class would stay submerged for around 2 days, possibly 3, but by then they'd be really pushing the limits of their batteries to stay submerged. They could snorkel, meaning they could come just below the surface and run their engines to charge the batteries, but they'd easily be spotted by a plane.
Being on board a Soviet submarine at that time was not a pleasant experience. And I say on board, when you say on board, you kind of think, oh, on board a ship and, you know, there's space around you and everything. A submarine's not like that. It's very different. You are inside the machine. It's not like there are mechanical quarters and the living quarters. It's all one thing. And you're down there with a crew, 74 crewmen you might have on these Soviet subs, with constant noise, a lack of fresh air, very limited amounts of fresh and clean water, just how cramped you would be.
So the next compartment or next room will be in here, which is the sonar room. It's positioned here right forward as far as possible away from the engines, and they need the noise to be as little as possible so that they can hear what's going on, so they can guide the ship. The sonar is what the submarine uses as its eyes and ears to find its way through the various undersea obstacles.
Your personal space wouldn't be very much more than the immediate space around you. It's no wonder that after a certain amount of time, that would start to get to you. And you might start to just lose your mind a little bit. Your judgment might not be as clear, and you'd be extremely stressed. These were the conditions that those Soviet crewmen were in for weeks on end, being submerged for 2 days at a time. But even when they did come up to get the batteries recharged, it's not like you could come up for fresh air and be out on deck. You're still stuck inside this machine.
This weakness plays a crucial role in 1962, when 4 of these Soviet submarines confront the U.S. Navy during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet submarines that are in the Caribbean are Foxtrot-class boats. The Americans do not pick up all of the Foxtrots that are out in the Atlantic. They pick up 2, force them to surface by basically sitting over the top of them until they run out of breathable air. But the other 2 manage to sneak through.
But unknown to the U.S. forces, the remaining 2 Foxtrots are carrying torpedoes armed with nuclear warheads.
People don't realize just how close we came to World War III during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The U.S. was dropping depth charges, testing out their capability onto Russian subs down below. Now, these Russian subs had been in the water for a long time. One of them in particular was captained by a chap who he was just starting to lose it.
But because they were under orders not to communicate with Russia, they had no way of knowing what really was going on. But they knew from radio signals they could pick up bits and pieces that there was a lot going on the surface. The people were looking for them. The one captain was a bit trigger happy and was all ready to fire his nuclear-tipped torpedo.
He's been down under the ocean for way too long. He thinks World War III must have started, so he goes to press the button to send a nuclear warhead to the U.S. naval ships. And his colleague says, no, hang on, you can't do that. You can't do that, stop. So if there ever was an unsung hero, it would have to be that guy who stopped his commander from starting World War III.
These two submarines evade American capture and make it to Cuba. And for nearly 30 more years, Foxtrot submarines continue stalking international waters to spy on Western countries. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, hundreds of unwanted warships begin clogging the shipbreaking yards across the world, creating a different kind of catastrophe. And eventually moored in Riga, Latvia, the Black Widow lies among them.
These had to be disposed of properly, in a very thoughtful way. Otherwise, it's an environmental disaster waiting to happen. Yes, it might cost more than just taking it to a scrap heap and chopping it up and being done with it. But otherwise, the cost to the environment and to the Earth, who knows where that could go.
So why is the Soviet Black Widow U-boat in Rochester, England? And why was it finally abandoned? The Soviet Navy's B-39 U-475 submarine, also known as the Black Widow, served as a frontline marine deterrent, armed with nuclear torpedoes. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, this decaying nuclear submarine poses a huge environmental problem due to its radioactive contamination. Simply leaving the Black Widow to rot, unmaintained in Riga, Latvia, is not an option.
Of course, you have to remember that the Russian submarine is one of the more dangerous instruments of the Cold War. The first Russian nuclear submarine killed most of its own crew, and the Kursk famously killed all of its crew. The Russians were able to build and operate these vessels, but their safety standards were not always as high as they might have been. And the Soviets and later the Russians were quite happy to cover these things up as far as they could get away with it. So going to sea in a Russian submarine is not really a very attractive proposition.
In 1994, the Black Widow is officially decommissioned by the Russian Navy and sold to a private collector in Britain, who maintains it and turns it into a museum. Today, this hulking Cold War relic lies empty, rusted, and abandoned in Rochester, forming a floating reminder of a much more treacherous age. "3,500 miles away, across the Atlantic Ocean, are the lingering traces of a grand plan to revolutionize life on Earth. Obscured by trees in the suburbs of Long Island, New York, lies the remains of a new and bold system with groundbreaking designs to power the entire planet. The complex spreads across 16 acres, contains dozens of workshops, and has a wood-framed 187 feet tall, 90 feet wide tower, weighing 65 tons, topped with a hemispherical copper dome, weighing an additional 50 tons. But who built this giant structure? And why was it abandoned? At the end of the 19th century, Gas-based power is the norm in America. But industrialists are looking for a safer and more effective method to illuminate cities and power homes with electricity. But one scientist has an even bigger aim: to create enough electricity to run America.
Today, we take electricity for granted, but at the turn of the 19th century, it was the new black. It was full of wonder. It was a cure-all for almost anything, and its potential was limitless.
And powering this ambition is the revolutionary Wardenclyffe Tower. Built in 1901, its cutting-edge purpose is to harness the power of wireless electrical transmission.
This is a time of power and electricity, and all this sort of science, which is the way it should have been done, is seen almost in a sort of magical aspect, right? And they used to put on big shows to promote this. There's huge amounts of propaganda, in the same way that you may see that a magician would do like that. They were treated in that sort of way.
Inside Wardenclyffe today lies what's left of a ruined and vandalized laboratory building. People come from all over the world to explore these damp corridors and to look for clues of what happened here. During the early years of the 20th century, these ominous halls inspire rumors about mysterious experiments and only partially veil strange flashing lights, as well as the reclusive figure who works here, the half-genius, half-mad scientist, Nikola Tesla.
Tesla was a unique man. He was very private. He worked all the time. He was obsessed with inventing. I think he wanted to help the world. He wanted to do things that would benefit all of humanity.
The scale of Tesla's vision is tremendous, and that's just from his plans at Wardenclyffe. The groundbreaking facility requires a kind of engineering that's never been attempted before.
We're standing on the base of the Tesla Tower, a 187-foot high tower erected with wooden beams. And the thing on top, a big round copper hemisphere, was really a capacitor to hold voltage. He charged it to as much as he could, millions of volts, so high that he would go beyond the capacity and it would send out bolts of lightning.
This unique capacitor becomes Tesla's best-known invention, used in dozens of experiments. Its intent is to unleash a stream of electricity straight down into the Earth and into a special underground chamber. From there, the electricity is designed to travel along radiating tunnels and out into the Earth's crust.
What he was trying to do with this was develop power transmission and wireless power, because those Tesla coils are actually creating and sending radio waves or any sort of electromagnetic waves.
And he believed that he could set up a standing wave of electric potential within the crust of the Earth. A standing wave that's like a wave on a string attached to a jump rope. You move it just right, you got a standing wave, it doesn't travel. And all around the Earth would be these peaks and valleys of voltage. If you could tap into them, you could pick up power or maybe information. If you modulated the wave, you send information.
I think that sort of vision of creating power and distributing it out through a network, that's something that we have taken on board. Now, maybe not directly from Tesla, but it's another case of that's what needed to happen to transform the world.
But does Tesla's incredible invention actually work? And why was it finally abandoned? In 1901, Nikola Tesla builds a huge 187-foot tower with support buildings at Wardenclyffe on Long Island, just 60 miles east of New York City. For 5 years, he tries to create free electricity for all of America using huge towers and transmit it around the country wirelessly. But powerful forces are mobilizing against Tesla's bold plans. And his decision to opt for alternating current instead of direct current for his electricity brings him into conflict with another industrial pioneer, Thomas Edison.
Edison had direct current, DC, and Tesla had his alternating current, and AC. And there was a bitter rivalry between them, a real war between these two people. And Edison was just a better marketer than Tesla. Tesla was very focused on the science, on the possibilities, and even, thinking way ahead into the future, like this is how we change the world. The thing with the alternating current is that it was so much more useful for transmitting power. The DC current, it's like, well, that's essentially what we use. We only use that in batteries now. That's all we use DC current for. Power stations, it's so much easier to generate power in AC in huge quantities. It's so much easier to transmit that power over power lines. And even Tesla was starting to talk about what we are now trying to develop, which is wireless power.
Despite the technical superiority of alternating current, Tesla becomes his own worst enemy in his rivalry with Edison. His secretive experiments and obsessive behavior make it easy for the press to portray him as an oddity. This frightens Tesla's main financial backer, the leading financier, J.P. Morgan. And subsequently, he pulls his investment out of the Wardenclyffe project in 1906. Tesla has no choice but to abandon the whole enterprise.
Edison was able to smear him. He put on shows to show the dangers of alternating current, electrocuting elephants to shock people into thinking, no, DC's the way to go, it's safer, and all that sort of stuff. So, Tesla sunk into depression, he got ill, he died a very poor man, unfortunately, because, as we know from after his death, it was him that was right. He had the right track with alternating current. He even, perhaps they think, came up with radio before Marconi ever really did any of that. So Tesla, whilst being right, unfortunately, was not appreciated in his time.
Even the giant tower must be demolished for scrap to help pay off Tesla's debts, leaving nothing but a giant octagon-shaped footprint in its wake. Today, all that remains of Tesla's shattered dreams are a few support buildings and the empty foundation of his iconic tower at Wardenclyffe. Nikola Tesla claimed to have come very close to providing the Earth and its people with free electricity, only to be beaten by J.P. Morgan and the banks, who were dead set against his plans, and instead charged handsomely today for this utility.
The really disappointing thing about the Wardenclyffe Tower project is that it was halted halfway through due to allegedly lack of funding. Really? J.P. Morgan's your backer and he doesn't have money? Or is it possibly because Tesla is creating free energy that nobody can make any money off of? I think we need to look at that quite carefully.
2,500 miles away, high in the White Mountains of California, is an ominous facility with its eyes set firmly on the stars. (12,760 feet up on the Barcroft Plateau lies a decrepit research station with numerous science labs, observatories, and living spaces for up to 25 people. This remote station's focus was quite literally out of this world. But who built this facility, and why was it abandoned? In the 1950s, the space race is on, with the Soviet Union gaining the upper hand in practically all matters beyond Earth. the United States founds NASA in 1958. To gain its first human toehold in space, NASA must gather sensitive but crucial information about the perils of space travel. And to do it, they use this secretive location, the Barcroft Station.
It was incredibly important in developing space travel.
In the early 1950s, Barcroft Station is a classified research facility run by the U.S. Navy. But with the backing from NASA, the University of California take it over and convert Barcroft into a space research facility with grand ambitions to launch humans into outer space and return them safely. However, this big aim of the space program must start smaller, employing a unique colony: monkeys.
But this was built in 1951, and they started gathering meteorological data at that point and started raising laboratory animals up here. They started studying the chimpanzees' physiology because they were planning to send chimps up into space before they sent humans. And so they needed to understand about chimp physiology and also develop monitoring devices so they could monitor the health and condition of the chimps while they were up in space.
The monkeys are chosen to be the first creatures in America to fly into space and test whether it's safe for humans to fly.
This is an authentic relic from the early 60s, from the period when we were training chimps and macaques to go into outer space. This is a 55-gallon drum that's been fitted out with a little plexiglass seat, and it's a space capsule simulator. It's got insulation on the outside. It's fitted with catheters, which were surgically implanted in the animals, and this was for them to get accustomed to what they'd be doing in outer space.
With monkeys sealed inside them, barrel capsules are suspended beneath a helicopter and flown to Barcroft Station. This exercise begins an extended series of experiments to record physical responses to stress and changes in atmospheric pressure.
We're now on the ground floor of Barcroft Station. In the 60s, the ground floor had animal colonies. They had chimps and macaques here, and they studied the physiology of these animals, and they developed telemetry devices to monitor their conditions of their bodies and their health. Here, they could look at the effects of high elevation on the animals. They would train them to some extent, get them accustomed to sitting in little chairs, because when they put them in space capsules, they were confined.
You can train the animals to do things that are more similar to what humans might do in space. Press buttons, pull levers, and so on. And it also means that you can gather data that helps you with the design of the cabin that you will ultimately use to put humans into space.
But what will the efforts of these brave pioneers reveal? And why was this unique program abandoned? To catch up to the Soviet Union's breakthroughs in space and its iconic 1957 launch of Laika the dog, the Barcroft Research Station in California develops its own animal astronauts for NASA throughout the 60s.
Different countries sent up different animals, sometimes for obvious reasons, sometimes for less obvious reasons. For example, if you wanted to send animals up and you knew they weren't going to come back, you might send something like mice. But of course you want to do experiments on larger animals too, and in Sputnik 2, the Soviets sent up the dog Laika, and they had a policy where they took dogs off the street. The idea was that you would take animals that were used to living a harsh life, lack of food, lack of water, and therefore would be better adapted to the kind of experiments that they wanted to test.
But it's not just against the Soviets that the efforts at Barcroft must remain under wraps.
Imagine the scene. It's the 1960s, the summer of love. How many Americans realize that monkeys are being taken up to a 14,000-foot high mountain and experimented with so that they can get an advantage about how to launch a space program? I think if they knew that, they actually would have been horrified.
Using animals, sadly, was a very valuable step towards getting humans into space. You simply couldn't avoid doing these kind of experiments. If you want to test the effect of very high acceleration forces, you can do that on animals. If you want to test what harsh landings are like, you can do that on animals, and indeed they did. Even though there was knowledge about humans at high altitudes, what they didn't have at that point was knowledge about how the human body responded in a weightless environment. So those kind of experiments you can conduct on animals, and of course you do want to do that before you conduct them on humans.
This sad but crucial step gives the scientists at Barcroft the data they need to help prepare American astronauts for their first steps into space.
You can simulate temperature changes. You can put people in centrifuges who experience high Gs like in a rocket takeoff, but you can't do everything. We realize that even today. That's why we're still doing experiments at the International Space Station. Astronauts are guinea pigs in that regard. We're trying to understand how the human body is affected by weightless environment, how space radiation affects us. We are still finding our way with a lot of these things.
In the end, over a dozen monkeys successfully launch into space. The knowledge gained from their heroic efforts becomes invaluable to the human pilots of the Mercury and Apollo programs. With this stellar success, NASA and the University of California eventually suspend their animal research. Today, the Barcroft station lies abandoned in the mountains of California. A potent reminder of just what it takes and the sacrifices made for humanity's quest for the stars.